but they never did an examination for high temperatures. They never checked for accelerants. They never checked for explosives. First thing you learn in the fire academy, I've been told, fire standards, is to do that. The evidence wasn't protected. First thing you do as a police officer, I'm a former police officer, is to protect the scene. You protect the metal. The same with the fire standards, you protect the metal.
Well, the next step is to give the U.S. attorney time to act. So we are at this time in sort of a holding pattern. We do intend, as our transmittal letter to the U.S. attorney states, to supplement the information we've already provided. So there will be an opportunity for us to give even more information to the U.S. attorney to present. But nevertheless, right now, the U.S. attorney should be either convening or presenting or deciding to present to a grand jury, and the clock is ticking. After a certain point, we expect to follow up with them to find out whether they have in fact done so or are planning to do so. And if we receive word that they have not or plan not to after a certain point, then we have the opportunity under the law to go to federal court and seek a writ of mandamus, where the court would order the U.S. attorney to comply with the law and present. So that would be the next step if it came to that.
You found it. It's the real news with your host, David Knight.
I'll introduce the two individuals that we have here. We have Julio Gomez, and we also have David Meiswinkle, and they are both attorneys that are working with the organization that is trying to get this whole issue, the government conspiracy theory that has been the source of our unending wars since 9/11. They're trying to get this examined. You know, we got over 3,000 people who died on these attacks. Wouldn't it be good if we got the right person? You know, it's not enough when you have an atrocity just to go out and grab somebody or to go out and invade a country. You want to make sure that you got the right suspects who did this. And you want to make sure when you're dealing with the government that they're not doing something to create a narrative so they can enact a program that they already had there. So I want to talk to them now about the legal aspects of this. They're trying to get a grand jury set up on this. So joining us now are Julio Gomez and David Meiswinkle. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
And let me give the website as well. It's lcfor911.org. lcfor911.org. That's the Lawyers Committee for 9/11.org. Thank you for joining us, sir. Both of you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Let's talk, first of all, we'll get into some of the details because you've got a lot of exhibits talking about forensic evidence. But let's give people the big picture right now. What are you trying to accomplish here in terms of trying to get a federal grand jury to investigate this?
Well, thank you, David. Basically, under U.S. federal law, 18 U.S. Code Section 3332A, a citizen has the opportunity to present evidence to a U.S. attorney, and then the U.S. attorney is bound by law to bring that evidence of a federal crime to a grand jury. So what we have done is we have collected a variety of evidence and information that is consistent with the use of explosives at the World Trade Center on 9/11. We have prepared that along with what is essentially a brief that details that information. We've submitted that to the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. We did that on April the 10th. And what we're asking the U.S. Attorney in New York to do is to convene a grand jury or a special grand jury and to present the information in our petition to that grand jury with the hope and expectation that a grand jury of Manhattan citizens will follow up and use the powers that they have as a grand jury to take the investigation further. To investigate, to subpoena everyone who is identified in our petition, to question them about their conclusions, and to follow through with identifying persons who may have additional information that the grand jury can then explore, and then, if it is so convinced, issue indictments regarding the use of explosives on 9/11 at the World Trade Center.
And, you know, a grand jury is a very powerful thing, especially if you get some honest people on it. I remember when they had the Oklahoma City bombing grand jury, and there was one prominent citizen who was put on it, Hoppy Heidelberg, and he started asking some very uncomfortable questions about that particular incident. And it got very difficult for the government. They had to they had to maneuver away from that. So that is a very powerful device to have that. So you're at the point now where you've put together this lengthy legal documents, 50 some odd pages, laying out the legal case that you just gave us an overview of. Here's the terms of how grand juries are organized under law, and the process and the rights of citizens to report potential federal crimes to a grand jury, and the fact that the Department of Justice has to relay those citizens' reports to a grand jury. You've laid out all that stuff there, and you've also got forensic reports. I mean, what happens to it at this point? I mean, what is the next step?
Well, the next step is to give the U.S. Attorney time to act. So we are at this time in sort of a holding pattern. We do intend, as our transmittal letter to the U.S. Attorney states, to supplement the information we've already provided. So there will be an opportunity for us to give even more information to the U.S. Attorney to present. But nevertheless, right now the U.S. Attorney should be either convening or presenting or deciding to present to a grand jury, and the clock is ticking. After a certain point, we expect to follow up with them to find out whether they have in fact done so or are planning to do so. And if we receive word that they have not or plan not to after a certain point, then we have the opportunity under the law to go to federal court and seek a writ of mandamus, where the court would order the U.S. Attorney to comply with the law and present. So that would be the next step if it came to that.
All right, that's great. Look, right now, you're before the court of public opinion. And I think whether or not the federal government gives you an honest hearing, or whether they try to slow walk this or delay this, now we have an opportunity for you guys to make this case to the court of public opinion. Let's talk a little bit about the forensic evidence that you've outlined here in your long presentation here. Tell us a little bit about some of the evidence that you've created. Give us an overview of that, and then give us some specifics, if you will.
Right, David.
Why don't I start? Go ahead.
We have to realize that this 17 years later, what we're doing is compiling the evidence and submitting it to a grand jury. But this should have been done from the beginning.
Yes.
It's a crime in the sense that it wasn't done from the beginning. There are 118 firemen that heard explosions in the buildings. 155 first responders, all told. There were people that experienced explosions in the basement prior to the building even being hit by an airplane. There are scientists that have found red-gray chips, which are indicative when they study them with the electronic microscope of nanothermite. It's a high-grade military explosive that was, we believe, involved in bringing the buildings down. You have unexplained happenings with the physicists have studied the free fall of the buildings. It's impossible for a building to fall at a free fall rate. The two towers fell at nearly a free fall. Building 7 fell for 2.3 seconds at free fall. Even the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was called in to investigate, they cannot explain the free fall. At first, they wouldn't admit to it, and when it was pointed out to them, they had to redo their assessment, but they couldn't explain the free fall. The free fall is explained easily if you factor in explosives. The explosives are necessary to take the bottom of the building out. A building is supported.
Absolutely right. Well, hang on. We're going to come back to that. We've got to take a break. We're going to be right back. And of course, Building 7, that third building, wasn't even hit by a plane. Still came down in free fall. Very interesting, isn't it? We're going to fact check the government conspiracy theory. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to a couple of lawyers who are with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. You can find their website, lcfor911.org. LC as in Lawyers Committee, the word for, and 911.org. They have put together a very detailed document talking about the legal requirement to have a grand jury investigation if citizens exercise their rights to report a crime and evidence of a crime. They have worked with a lot of people who've been putting together evidence that refutes the official conspiracy story of the government. They want that evidence presented. And as we just heard, I think it was David Meiswinkle say that we should have had a grand jury investigation already. Instead, we had a kind of a political commission that went through this. We had a lot of people reporting that they heard explosions. We had President Trump, by the way, and we're going to play this clip for you probably after our guests leave because I don't want to take any time away from them. But President Trump immediately after that saying, yeah, that's a very strong building. It's one of the strongest skyscrapers I've ever seen. You know, they tried to blow it up back in the 90s. They put a bomb in the foundation, didn't even do anything to that building. He says, all steel on the outside. He goes, I can't see that happening with just planes hitting it. There had to be explosions, said President Trump at the time. Well, he was exactly right. And gentlemen, I want to ask you, and I do want to go back to this forensic evidence that you're breaking down, Mr. Meiswinkle, but also as lawyers, don't you find it strange that there weren't any repercussions against the architects of that building if these three buildings just collapsed into their footprint? And of course, Building 7 wasn't even hit by a plane. It was allegedly got a secondhand fire from one of these other buildings, and then it just collapsed into its footprint. I mean, if that were the case, wouldn't you expect that there would be lawsuits against the architects for designing such faulty buildings, or against the building inspectors who obviously maybe failed if the architects didn't fail?
Well, there were. The matter of the fact that the buildings weren't faulty, they were very well made.
Yeah.
What's problem is the government's reports are faulty. In fact, in the WTC,
that was a rhetorical question.
Right, in the Building 7 that comes mysteriously down at free fall rate at 2.3 seconds, their reports, which it took 8 years to generate, left out some very important things. They left out these stiffener plates. They left out the shear studs. They left out the lateral support beams. And they put the wrong seating capacity for this one girder, 2001, which was connected to the column 79 on the 13th floor. And when this supposedly area gives out, there's a cascade and the whole building comes down in 6.5 seconds. You must remember this third skyscraper was 47 stories high, 610 feet would be the biggest building in 33 states. It came down, was not hit by an airplane. Simple office fires. Office fires normally they would burn probably 400, 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if it was hit by an airplane, it would only burn probably about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit with the jet fuel. But to melt steel, it takes 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. There was temperatures down at the bottom of these buildings, which were hotter than anything that could have been at the top of the buildings months later, which shows you that there was extreme temperatures that caused the melting of metal, the melting of iron. In fact, the firemen said it looked like lava down there. It was cascading or rolling down the channels like lava that would indicate that the use of explosions. The only way it can explain the iron microspheres that were found in the electronic microscopes. Iron microspheres, the iron would be leftover byproduct of the nanothermite. So to go back to your question about the flawed buildings from the architects, these buildings were made to stand. They were brought down by controlled demolition, explosions, and bombs. The only way they could be brought down, and all the reports that were done by the National Institute of Standards and Technology were, well, I would say they were fraudulent reports. Even FEMA told the NIST that they should look for these, do an examination of these high temperatures. But they never did an examination for high temperatures. They never checked for accelerants. They never checked for explosives. First thing you learn in the fire academy, I've been told, fire standards is to do that. The evidence wasn't protected. First thing you do as a police officer, I'm a former police officer, is to protect the scene. You protect the metal. The same with the fire standards. You protect the metal. You examine it forensically. You see it was sulfidation. Sulfidation can only occur with extreme heat. Extreme heat can't be generated from jet fuel from an airplane or from simple office fires, which the government said. Simple office fires brought the buildings down. Never in the history of these steel-structured buildings has a building come down from a simple office fire. Impossible. Never will happen again. It happened that day 3 times. Has to be investigated. Finally, 17 years later, hopefully the grand jury will look at it, and that's the grand jury is like the people that are listening in, regular people that are going to use their common sense. We would say, go to the exhibits. The exhibits show the buildings coming down in the North Tower, the South Tower, and the Building 7, and you'll say, my God, these buildings were exploded down. It's just common sense without the science. The scientists, though, they support it. And that's why, there's no politics to grind here. The science is the science. Free fall. There's a law there. There's a resistance. Buildings can't come down the way they did, the way the government explained it. The only way they can come down is if they were exploded to come down.
That's right. Facts are stubborn things, and they've been there. People have been looking at these facts for quite some time. Before we go to you, Mr. Gomez, I just wanted to follow up with Mr. Meiswinkle. When I said, what if these buildings were faulty or the building codes were faulty? You said they left out all this stuff. That was left out of their reports. That was left out of their models, is what. Just to clarify that those various things that you were very specific about.
Right. Yes. Thanks for pointing that out, David. What happened was it took 8 years to get these reports. Eventually, architects, Tony Zimbardi, who was a mechanical engineer, he was able to get a hold of the blueprints, and other architects and engineers too, and they saw that NIST purposely left off the stiffener plates, the shear studs, the lateral support beams, they were on the building. And as they were on the building, these buildings could have never came down the way NIST said they came down. In other words, they fudged the report. All right, they should be held accountable for that.
Yes, very important. Mr. Gomez, go ahead.
Well, yes, you'd have to rewrite the building codes, and you would have to refurbish every building in the United States if simple fires on certain floors can bring down entire buildings of this size and magnitude.
Yeah, and let me interject here. Tony Rook in the UK, his father was a police officer, and he got together with other firemen in the UK, and they said, if this is the case, why aren't we also changing not just the building codes, but why aren't we also changing our firefighting procedures? And so he was taking it to the UK government and saying, because the UK government is saying this is true. The BBC said, we've just been told that Building 7 fell down, and it was right over her shoulder as she was saying that. Why would she expect that was going to be the case? You'd never had a steel building fall down in its footprint just from office fires, as Mr. Meiswinkle was saying. That had never happened before. But yeah, it's not only the building codes, as you just pointed out, Mr. Gomez, but it's also firefighting procedures and so forth. None of that stuff changed afterwards. We just changed our laws and Constitution.
That's correct. Right. So what we've done in the petition, David, is you'll see very clearly the petition breaks down the evidence into three very simple categories. They are forensic evidence, expert opinion, and testimony. Those are the three basic types of evidence that are presented in any court of law in just about any case that requires some sort of scientific analysis. And then in more detail, David Meiswinkle, my colleague, has covered some of it. But essentially, the forensic evidence focuses on an analysis of the World Trade Center dust samples, confirming the presence of high-tech explosives. The expert opinion in the petition ranges from expert opinions from architects and engineers whose observations indicate that the fall is consistent with the characteristics of demolition by use of explosives. It also includes an analysis of the seismic data at World Trade Center, which again is consistent with the use of explosives. It is absolutely true. There is no precedent for a steel-framed building to collapse in this way for this type of reason. There are technical analyses, video evidence of the World Trade Center building collapses attached to our petition.
All right, hang on, Mr. Gomez. We've got to take a quick break here, and we're going to be right back with David Meiswinkle and Julio Gomez of LCFOR911.org. We need to have an investigation for the event that changed our country. Welcome back. I'm David Knight. We're talking about the incident that not only took 3,000 lives, I mean, that in and of itself should have warranted a thorough grand jury investigation at the time. I'm talking about 9/11, of course, and we're talking to the Lawyers Committee for 9/11. You can find their website at LCFOR911.org. Lawyers Committee for 9/11.org. They are trying to get, finally, a legitimate grand jury investigation, not a political commission that's running through this. And I want to go back to, we're going to talk to Mr. Gomez, Julio Gomez. He was talking about the different aspects that they want to make sure that that the categories this all breaks down into: the forensic evidence, the expert opinion, the eyewitness testimonies and videos. And that's all part of this massive document that they put together to begin this legal process for a long overdue investigation that has been used to transform our country. And we want to see justice done as well, but we also want to know the basis for which they transformed our country, if that truly does stand up to an examination of the facts. Many of us don't believe that it does. And of course, these gentlemen who have been investigating this for a very long time don't believe it does. Before we go back to Mr. Gomez, Mr. Meiswinkle, David Meiswinkle, I would like to, since you said you're a former police officer, and you said they skipped over the investigation of the temperature at the site, as NIST had said that they should do. It looked like the investigation, the simulation of the collapse of Building 7, they intentionally left out a lot of structures that were there. They didn't do explosives tests and everything. But also, as you point out, destroying the scene of the crime. As a police officer, you pointed out that you always take care to preserve the scene of the crime. They did just the opposite, didn't they, Mr. Meiswinkle?
Excuse me, that's right. The first thing you learn in the academy is to preserve the scene of a crime. This wasn't just any crime. It happened to be the worst crime in our history, and approximately 3,000 people were killed.
Yes.
So that would be the protocol, is to protect it, to have your ID people come in to examine, especially the steel, also to take account of the pulverization of concrete, which is quite amazing. That whole day, everything that happened, not only in New York City but throughout the other areas, the Shanksville and the Pentagon, everything was strange and has to really be looked at. As I said too, the protocol for fire to prevent the spoliation of evidence, so they can look at it. The fire departments would normally, with this type of catastrophe, always check for accelerants and explosives. NIST made a point not to do that. That's the first thing they should have done, really. That's the most logical hypothesis. They assumed the least likely hypothesis, which had never happened before, that office fires could bring the buildings down.
Yeah, and they just wanted to move along as quickly as they could so they could enact their public agenda. And of course, there's, as you point out, a lot of strange things that were happening. It wasn't just confined to what happened in New York. You had Gore Vidal say, I knew instantly that this wasn't true because my dad was involved in the creation of NORAD. I knew how that would work. You got pilots who say, you couldn't have flown planes that fast at this altitude and so forth. And immediately after the events, President Trump looked at this and said, that couldn't have happened like that. There had to be explosives involved in some way or the other. But Mr. Gomez, let's talk a little bit about, let's go back to that evidence. We talked about the forensic evidence, the fact that in the dust they have found presence of high-tech explosives and so forth. So there's the forensic evidence. We've talked a little bit about expert opinion, how that was rigged by the so-called experts. Let's talk a little bit about the eyewitness testimony and some of the existing videos that are part of your exhibits that you have as part of this brief, this legal brief that you filed.
The eyewitness testimony is particularly compelling, David. So we have a testimony from World Trade Center janitor William Rodriguez. He was witness to explosions in the basement and in the lobby of the World Trade Center before the plane impacts. A grand jury deserves to examine that testimony. There's a testimony of former New York Housing Authority official, the late Barry Jennings. He was trapped in World Trade Center Building 7 for some time. He witnessed explosions in that building. There is the eyewitness testimony accounts of numerous firefighters. These are official accounts. You can find them in New York Times's archives, where tons of firefighters hear explosions, report synchronized explosives in the building, not just sporadic sounds, but synchronized explosions. And more importantly, you have firefighters and police officers who witnessed the presence of molten steel at ground zero. You can't have molten steel from an ordinary progressive collapse of a building or even from a controlled demolition collapse of the building. When Las Vegas casinos are brought down to build new ones, you don't generate molten steel in that collapse. Molten metal requires sustained enormous heat for a sustained period of time. Something had to generate that kind of heat to melt the steel at ground zero, but no one's ever investigated it. This is the kind of evidence and testimony from very reliable witnesses, people who are professionals, that deserves to be studied seriously and investigated further by a grand jury. And no grand jury has ever examined this kind of information. You had grand jury indictments against Zachariah Moussaoui. You had grand jury indictments against Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for being the mastermind. But those indictments don't deal with the actual destruction of the building. They don't deal with the use of explosives. So none of this information has ever been presented, as far as we know, to a grand jury, and it deserves to be. Yes,
absolutely. And that, I think, is one of the biggest smoking guns right there. taking away, destroying the crime scene, not having a true investigation, as you correctly pointed out. We had the terrorists indicted and they presented evidence against them and so forth, but not looking at the actual scene of the crime. Does this actually match the government's official story? That's the key thing that was overlooked throughout all of this. And no eyewitness testimony was involved in any of that. We didn't have any forensic evidence that they skipped over. They destroyed forensic evidence there. Your comments, Mr. Meiswinkle.
Well, we're talking about what happened after 9/11. The investigation that the government did was up to the building's collapse. They never explained the actual collapse and the aftermath. When you're talking about what happened to the United States and what happens to our Constitution, we went into a war because of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was instigated because of these collapses. In other words, we've seen all types of draconian measures come in because of the government story, which, according to our petition, is misleading and it's wrong. It's not what happened. So you have our freedoms being undermined with the Homeland Security, the Patriot Bill. You have the indefinite detention. You have all this drone action. You have torture of people many times. And the whole narrative is wrong. It's misplaced narrative. The real narrative, the real narrative should be looking at this evidence that my colleague Julio just pointed out and examine that and then develop an investigation based on that and lead to suspects based on that evidence. That's where you have to go. They had the suspects lined up, at least seems before the incident even happened. That was rushed to judgment, as you've seen in the Kennedy assassination, the book by Mark Lane. There was a rush to judgment. That was a rush here to move past this real quick, get into the Middle East, start wars there, kill millions of people unjustifiably, and then admit, okay, we were wrong about Iraq's involvement, but nevertheless, and they haven't returned us to where we were before 9/11. Our Constitution has been taken a big hit. It's been hijacked.
Absolutely. And I think that was the purpose of all of this. We see them being disproven about weapons of mass destruction and the Iraq War and so forth. They need to be disproven about this fundamental thing because it was such a large crime. So much destruction was witnessed by people. So many people died that the American public now, as we look at this, and of course, this is something that really is a part of the news. We just had Gina Haspel's hearings yesterday where they were talking to her about torture. This is what has happened to America, that we condone and promote people who engage in torture for things that we used to execute Japanese officers for doing that to American prisoners. We came to accept that because we accepted this narrative. And we've seen this type of thing happen many times. We saw it with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. We saw it with the beginning of the Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine. Let's remember the Maine. Let's remember the fact that we didn't have an investigation of that for 70 or 80 years. And they said, yeah, it didn't really happen the way the government said, but they got their war out of it. I think that's the most important thing. That's why it is so important, this effort that you have to do a grand jury investigation. Your comments, Mr. Gomez.
Well, you're absolutely right, David. The event of 9/11, the horror, has been used as a pretext to diminish our constitutional rights.
Yes.
And we have to be very clear about the fact that our rights are threatened. Habeas corpus has been suspended. The fact everything
in our rule of law, everything in the Constitution, and constant war. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Again, you can find them at lcfor911.org, and you can join them and help them to push this forward. Do that, lcfor911.org.
Years ago, Infowars Life created the powerful MycoZX formula to help you combat internal yeast. As the years went on and more toxins were pumped into the environment, our team knew we had to create a bigger and better formula to help support your gut health. MycoZX Plus is the result of the search for that formula, a unique natural formula designed to support the body's natural cleansing of yeast and fungal organisms. There's no better product to help your body fight back. MycoZX Plus helps support a healthy microbial balance in the body, supports your digestive tract, and addresses the intestinal yeast that can cause you problems if it goes unchecked. Powered by an impressive list of ingredients, including grapefruit seed extract, pau d'arco bark, and grapeseed extract, our formula is fueled by ingredients that stood the test of time as powerful microbalancing properties. Pick up a bottle of the new and improved MycoZX Plus today at InfoWarsLife.com. That's InfoWarsLife.com.